All right, hello World War II fans, and welcome back to another Let's Play video. Here we are playing on the Eastern Front as usual, and I'm going to play a different scenario than the last one I did. The last scenario was effectively the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Third Reich, Operation Barbarossa, and as we saw, the German playstyle, once you get a hang for it, I find it to be extremely capable. Actually, let me see right here. Oh, I just thought I got a message there on Discord. But anyways, the German methodology, at least in this game, in the context of Eastfront 2, I would say the most effective formula for them during Barbarossa is economic expansion. Or a better way to put it would be economical expansion. And I don't want to go into too many details about this in this video, but the idea is to have the German army always have its forces prioritize movement to the east more than anything else, more than any battle, primarily. When you have that idea set in mind and your focus is on ensuring that your army groups are moving across the territories and advancing the units in the most economic way possible, what you essentially have is a steady German steamroll moving east. The Soviet response is one that is really complicated, to say the least. I find that the Soviet faction, at least right now in my play style of the game, is more difficult to play than the German army, at least during the summer period. On the winter side, the roles are effectively reversed, and I find the German side to be a lot more difficult to play. But the main issue for the Soviet army, especially in the summer of 1941, is that they really don't have a full army. And if they do, because on paper their army is quite impressive, it's scattered throughout the Soviet Union. So you have the twofold effect of trying to coagulate or combine your forces into one cohesive army, while at the same time dealing with the German onslaught, which tends to be quite devastating. So really, no matter how you look at it, the first sequence of Operation Barbarossa is absolutely devastating for the Red Army. And what follows next is a period in which the Red Army essentially needs to recover its losses if it wants to have any fair chance of matching the German strength. Because keep in mind that in Barbarossa, the German units are basically four-stacked across the entire front from the beginning. And all their units are almost all at full strength, including a lot of panzers, and their infantry. So the German side, as far as preparation goes, far exceeds the Soviet side, because not only do they have strong units, but their units are in large numbers, immense numbers. So the Soviet frontline forces, and you'll find the main problem with the Red Army, as you saw in the last game, was that we never really had the time to establish a solid defense that was solid enough to allow us to then have the breathing room to build new units or to replenish the losses that were sustained earlier in the campaign. Instead, what we get is a period in which we're forced to use our production points on Soviet headquarters, who are responsible for keeping the withdrawal moving back smoothly. And the idea was to be always one step ahead of the Germans as far as pulling back. And that way we could avoid some kind of operational decisive battle by simply never even engaging the German side. And when you do that, I just found that the production of keeping the HQs fully active to be quite expensive. Each Soviet HQ costs 10 production points, and the Soviet economy at its peak is at around 60. And as the campaign steadily unfolds, it starts to go into decline with the cutting off of Leningrad and the taking of the Donetsk industrial basin to be probably the heaviest blows, I would say, as far as losing economy. And there's a big shift in economic strength when that happens, as the German economy suddenly rises to 71 or 70, and the Soviet economy drops down to about 50. And so when you are dealing with a situation, a changing situation where your production goes down from around 60 to 50, and you're spending every single production turn about 30 production points on 3 Soviet HQs, you find that you're spending well over half of your production points on just the headquarters alone, just to keep the forces that you have available mobile and having them being able to pull back if need be. And I found that it was a very difficult process to establish a stable line when I'm spending all my money on HQs, and any other money I had left over would be spent on building new Soviet armies. And the cadre cost of Soviet units are double than the regular costs. So although it's true Soviet units are cheap to replenish their losses, they are a little bit pricier when it comes to building them all together. And I found that the one-step Soviet armies are not necessarily the most reliable units when it comes to defense. They need some more time to receive more reinforcements before they can really have their mainstay of being effective. And so the real challenge for Barbarossa overall has been the problem of giving the Soviet army enough breathing room, enough R&R to then replenish its losses. And really, that doesn't happen until the weather changes, when finally the mud season comes around or the winter season comes around, and the German army is a lot less mobile than what they were throughout the summer of 1941. And against a good German player, against at least what you saw what I was able to do, the German side still was able to do relatively well in the winter campaign. And that is in large part because they battered the Soviet army so much, the Soviets didn't even bother attacking during the winter period. And after spending some time reading in the forums of BoardGameGeek.com, which is where I heard about the game for the first time, don't mind the voice cracks there, I would say that the Soviet strategy during this early part of the war is arguably the toughest part of the game. It certainly isn't, because I've seen in other forums the Soviet army struggle a lot in the later stages of the conflict, and I certainly have seen scenarios where the German army gets absolutely battered. So there's a lot of room for flexibility here in this game, which is really nice to see. The developers did a great job of creating a really interesting mechanism for gameplay. And it can really go both ways. It really can go both ways. It really boils down to not the quality of the units, although obviously that plays a part in the battles, but it really boils down to the players' decisions and how do they organize their forces accordingly. And there's both a combat aspect to it, where you obviously want to have units that are strong for combat, although combat is usually unpredictable. And there are some really decisive dice that can go either way. And so the dice are quite unpredictable, I would say, as well. You can't really assume. You can plan for the hope for the best, but you got to plan for the worst in a way. And as far as the Soviet strategy goes, I mean, I think the role of Maskarovka, which is the Soviet philosophy of war involving deception, Maskarovka, a mask, I think is really one of the most powerful tools that the Red Army not only has, but in fact needs to rely on in order to actually do well in the game. Because although the Soviet armies are extremely weak at the early Winter 41 stage or late Barbarossa stage, a lot of the units are going to be under strength. The reinforcements that are coming in will be under strength because they themselves have been newly built. The only thing that's really keeping the Soviet army intact, assuming the German army has advanced economically, which is a very fair assumption, is the weather. If the Germans had a little bit more weather, with an economic German side who's been able to maintain their tempo, and maybe I should elaborate more on that too, this German HQ tempo, which is one in which essentially the German HQs never really fully exhaust themselves. And you'll find that there's always going to be at least one German HQ that will be at full strength at any given turn or any given fortnight, which allows the German army to make operational gains in some sector of the front, if not the entire sector. They can do that in the beginning. They can push across the entire sector, but in the later stages, they need to kind of prioritize each army group. But it actually works quite well because the Soviet army is so exhausted, so battered down that, as long as the German army is able to keep its forces advancing, the issue of having insufficient combat power is not really a problem for the German army. A lot of their units can get under strength, and I think it's part of the role of the German side to do everything they can to keep their army breathing and functioning well. But I find that they have plenty of units and plenty of strong units. The big problem for the German army, I would say, is really keeping their HQs fully active. So with all that said, that winter Soviet scenario is definitely one that requires more exploration. The last thing I'll say that I learned from the forums is that the Soviets do have to learn how to put some pressure on their German adversary, because putting pressure on the Germans is the best defense during the winter campaign. The best Soviet defense is an offense because of the inherent, call it winter penalty costs that the German side is going to have to deal with HQ production. Their production increases by 50%. So rather than paying the typical 10 production points for the HQs, it goes up to 15. And so it's very important the Soviet player puts the pressure on German HQ activation, because the HQs are quite costly, and it's very easy for the German side to spend all their production on HQs. And so the way the Soviet army goes about doing that is by attacking different areas, but not simply attacking. I think there has to be a bit of a I don't know what the word would be right now. It's slipping my mind, but essentially kind of spoiled attacks or prodding attacks, or even placements of other units in other positions, almost like a game of chess, that force the German side to respond. It doesn't necessarily have to be operational. It can be strategic placement of units that force the German army to think twice about what the Soviets are trying to do. And I think this is really where the notion of Maskarovka really kicks in, because you'll see that the Soviets can build a lot of units in the winter stage, but their units are going to be very low quality. So I think in a way, if the Soviet side learns how to really maximize their Maskarovka, it can actually work extremely well for the Soviets, because it basically forces the German army to assume the worst, and they have to respond accordingly. And I find that the German lines tend to be a little rigid during the winter campaign. German lines can be quite strong, although they're not invincible. And often it's the case that a two-core German position is still very vulnerable to Soviet attacks and the Soviet breakthroughs. I usually say that about 3 German units usually is enough to spoil any Soviet assault, at least the first wave. But you'll quickly realize that the big problem for the German army is usually a lack of manpower. Ironically, despite having all the quality manpower in Barbarossa, when it comes to fighting defensively, I find that the Germans don't have enough troops to fully, thicken the defensive lines and create like a impenetrable, fortified region in the east to siege Russia and to withstand any Soviet counter moves. The Germans simply don't have enough units. Now, I know in the Eurofront game that the Germans actually have access to fortress units, which I think in the player aid card, yep, here they are, they're fort units. You'll notice that they have no mobility features. They're basically units that are able to roll combat dice, and their offensive power is single fire, but their defensive is triple fire. And I think they even have triple defense, if I'm not mistaken, as well. So they're literally mobile forts, analogous to Leningrad or Sevastopol or any other fortress position in the West Front game or Eurofront game. And I've heard from more experienced players that they are actually able to deploy those forts on the Eastern Front. And if you want, you can place them somewhere right outside of Moscow. And I would find that to be a very interesting scenario where basically the Germans are entrenching themselves outside of Moscow, which is a very interesting strategic move, given that it will allow the Germans to move a lot of their other units, which are better suited for offensive operations anyways, to then concentrate in other areas like the more open southern sector of the front. So Maskarovka is definitely going to be an important tool that the Soviets need to learn more of. And unfortunately, with my solo playthroughs, it really, that's the one aspect of solo playthrough that's very hard to deal with, I would say. It's a feature of the game, or it's a feature of the strategy that's somewhat lost, because these units, these Soviet units, as I'm switching between both sides, I typically get a feel for what the German strength, or rather what the Soviet strength is in when I switch to the German side. And the problem with that, of course, is that these German units are a lot stronger. So I'm beginning to learn that you can't play the Soviets like you play a standard army. You have to be a lot more unorthodox. And I think the Maskarovka aspect is key to that. And it's ironic because later in the later stages of the conflict, the Soviets actually have the numerical advantage. And yet, in order to go toe-to-toe with the German army and to achieve, I would say, stunning victories against the German army, stunning. I mean, we're talking victories that are right on par with the German successes during Barbarossa, involves Maskarovka. I think otherwise you probably get kind of like a stalemate type engagement, where obviously the Soviets have the local firepower advantage, but because they're attacking, it gets somewhat nullified by the inherent bonus of the German side defending. And that's something that I think tends to be underrated, is, at least from a historical standpoint, just the amount of skill the Allies had to develop in order to crack the German defensive doctrines and to crack Fortress Europe, Europa, Fortress Europa, as Hitler would put it, or something like that. And I mean, Hitler's strategy post Stalingrad, and I guess post Kursk primarily, was done almost out of circumstance more than out of pure choice. But the Germans essentially dug in wherever they stood their ground at that point in the conflict, and the Allies had to push them out. And this was a very big part of the conflict, but 1943 is a very fascinating year on the Eastern Front, because we see the transitionary phase from Kursk, where it used to be a German offensive, very quickly becoming a Soviet one. And the Soviets do end up pushing the German army all the way from Kursk, all the way to the Dnieper River by the end of 1943. And then the Winter Campaign of 1943 involves conquering the rest of the Ukraine, basically, by the Soviets. So really intense Soviet operations. And maybe the reason why it worked was that although on paper both sides were equally matched as far as firepower goes, the Soviets were able to maximize their successes via the application of Maskarovka. So anyways, these are just some thoughts on the game and a little bit of World War II history, but a lot of my World War II history thoughts are based on like abstract, documentaries or games. I really do have to wonder exactly how accurate am I being with my analyses, given the lack of data that I like to use to analyze. So I don't know, maybe call it just kind of a personal observation based off of my time watching a lot of World War II YouTube videos, I guess. Am I a historian? No. Do I want to be? I don't know. It's a big commitment of time and resources, but it is an interesting subject, I must admit. And the military history is really impressive. I find it amazing how a lot of people on YouTube, especially, they really know their stuff, and they go spend hours breaking down the facts of really how certain things were built. I find that the entire history of not just World War II, but call it early 20th century or first half 20th century shipyard production. It'll be really fascinating. And a lot of World War II channels are coming out on other subjects as well. Or, World War II aviation history and just general kind of odd bits of military history facts, whether it's on certain equipment or certain tactical doctrines or certain productions of certain vehicles. It's all very fascinating stuff. What subject material would I want to dive into? I would imagine it would probably fall into more of the art of war side of things. And I probably would spend more of my time exploring the history of the decision-making processes that these generals were trying to do during these battles. And probably if I had to really guess the area that I would want to understand the most would probably be the later stages of the war between the Soviet armies and the German armies when, the Germans were losing. There's been a lot of controversy in how specifically World War II army history has been unpacked, and due to the nature of the Cold War and the fact that West Germany was somewhat a strong player of NATO, and the West would interview a lot of, or interrogate, I guess, or interview, seemed to be more interview like. They access a lot of the memoirs of these former Nazi generals. And we, for a long time, assumed that they were free of bias. In reality, they had a lot of biases. And so the picture has been distorted, and there's still more to learn. And frankly, I don't personally read enough books. I've actually yet to read an entire book in its entirety. I usually don't finish the World War II books that I start. And I typically grew up, more with the encyclopedias of World War II, and they were a lot more picture driven. And there were some interesting books I had that had really cool illustrations of the operations, and the illustrations of operations are probably my favorite part of World War II because the maps, the maneuvers, the theory is really fascinating. But it's unfortunate to see that the reality of war tends to be a lot grimmier than what the maps suggest. And unfortunately, a German general trying to move his panzer divisions around to a flanking tack definitely doesn't go out as well as one would think, because of the hard realities that there's a lot of other aspects of war that the German high command simply didn't really prioritize, starting with logistics. And this is a problem that all the nations dealt with. But I find that the clash between both the German high command and the Soviet Stavka and the methodologies of waging war were similar yet different. And ultimately, the Soviets came out on top, but not after fighting the Germans. And it's really fascinating to see that both sides had really powerful defensive doctrines. But when it came to offensive operations, it's a bit more convoluted. But the Soviets seem to have figured out strategic maneuvers that decimated the Germans. So with that said, I think I've ranted enough about a bunch of other topics I wanted to get out of the way. But I think I pretty much have set a video. I think what I have in front of me is really just a nice background for the video I've been making. But if you've been wondering what exactly have we been staring at, this is a scenario that I made myself. It's really the only one I've made thus far, and I don't really know if I'm going to make any more. But this is an Eastfront scenario I wanted to share. And I was able to get a website. I found a website that through YouTube that had some pretty interesting data on the placement of units. And based off of that, I kind of went about setting up these. It's not 100% accurate. There's obviously going to be some areas and positions that are somewhat convoluted, but overall, I think I did a pretty good job. I put OKH, for example, in Vinica, which I believe is where Hitler's bunker was in the Ukraine. A few units I wasn't exactly sure even existed. For example, I believe some of these units here, like the 59th or the 16th Corps, I wasn't sure about. I think there's even a 64th Infantry Corps that I still to this moment don't know where it goes. So there's a few units that are here and there I'm not sure about on the German side. The Soviet side, I was actually able to find a lot of really impressive data, but I had to make a few changes or a few assumptions. For example, I believe these third guard units, really all the guard units that you see, are not guard yet. They are right now just standard armies, and post-Kursk they will become guard units as they have earned the title of being elite. But beyond that, this unit here, for example, that mech unit that you see there, and the cavalry unit for that matter, the mech unit, the third guard mech unit that's there on the right, I believe it's actually going to be a third tank corps. It is a tank corps, not a mech corps, and it's going to be the non-guard at the present moment. On the other hand, these very newly built Soviet actual tank units are actually going to be tank armies. So this would be the 5th Soviet Tank Army, not the 5th Guard yet, because we're in 1942 and won't be until really 43, 44 that the Guard units really start to materialize more on the Eastern Front. I think there are a few here and there, but the several dozen that are very well known don't materialize until after some of the major offensive operations in 1943, 1944. As for the cavalry unit, it is not going to be a Soviet cavalry army. It's a cavalry corps. So Soviets actually have their fair share of corps. Another thing to note is that the Soviet side actually doesn't even have the 62nd or 64th armies, which are the two major Soviet armies that defended Stalingrad. And in this game, they don't exist. So clearly, this game's data is somewhat imperfect. I'm pretty sure all World War II single sources of, World War II stats when it comes to the location of units on the battlefield at a particular date and time are going to be somewhat mismatched. I don't think there's a single one out there, whether it's the Russian sources or the German sources, that are going to be exactly identical, because there's a lot of human error here in the data recording process, in the accounting. And a lot of units, a lot of accountants, let's say, were not accountable for their works. So nevertheless, I think the setup is really well done. I mean, you can really get a sense for the early 1942 situation. And, I could pull up a map, but I really suggest those of you who are curious to go on Wikipedia and actually look at the front. But you can get a sense of the post-Moscow scenario really well here. The idea basically being that the German army in winter 40, or excuse me, yeah, I guess early winter 41, we'll say late 41, pushed onto Moscow, eventually ran out of momentum. And very quickly, what followed next was a Soviet series of counterattacks. And these counterattacks followed from a little attack, a counterblow at Moscow, to then full-scale operations that are trying to destroy the German army during the winter period. And you can see that there's a big Soviet bulge here in the north. And essentially what the Soviets were trying to do was do flanking attacks around Leningrad, as well as flanking attacks around Moscow, and try to encircle the German units from the north. And they even attempted operations in the south. And you can see that it was a bit of a clusterfuck. The Soviets eventually ran out of momentum as well. And the German side still very amazingly held on to Rezhev and Vyazma, which is very impressive given the situation. So the German army held the line, and right now it's kind of like two snakes trying to eat each other. Both armies are have had time to recover due to the mud period. And I think in May of 1942, the Germans launched the local counterattacks to stabilize the line a little bit. But now that we're in summer 1942, it's going to be the German strategic initiative. And so the war will go through a major change. There was Soviet attacks to relieve Leningrad, and the Germans were able to counterattack up there as well. And so what we know to be the Operation Case Blue is basically underway. I believe Case Blue doesn't actually begin until July of 1942, or I believe late June 28th, which I think is 3 days away from it being July. So I'm going to call it July, at least for this game and the way its calendar, system works. It's going to be on the July turn that the Germans started. And so I believe the German strategy at this stage in the war was to launch a few preliminary operations to improve the line. I'm assuming one of the major ones was to establish some kind of beachhead across this river before they launch any major operations. You can see the Germans have a lot of units in Kharkov, and that's because they actually recently launched a very powerful counterattack to destroy the Soviet units that were previously attempting to encircle Kharkov themselves. Kharkov would switch hands a lot of times in the war. I think at this point we've seen the second Battle of Kharkov. The first one being the one that took place in 1941 with a German success. Then there would be the Soviet counterplays, which recently were just thwarted. I believe that's the second battle, Kharkov. The third battle, Kharkov, would take place post-Stalingrad with a German counteroffensive after the Soviet breakthrough from Stalingrad. And that would be the Meinstein Counter-Offensive, which, Meinstein would very famously put in his journal entries, and the Western world would learn very well about. But in the large strategic picture, really didn't change much. But it was a local victory for the Germans at the time. And finally, the fourth battle is when post-Kursk, the Soviets take it back. So you can get a sense that this part of the sector of the front is the one that changes hands the most. And I think a lot of it has to do with the terrain. I mean, look how open. All these are open terrains. Now, I mean, yes, there's some river crossings, but compared to the fighting in the north, the north has many more forests and swamps that are much more difficult to fight through. But yeah, this is basically the preliminary setup to Case Blue. You can see that Army Group South has its fair share of units stacked up, fair share of panzers stacked up across the front, ready to make a push. A lot of Soviet units are here. These are going to be the main units that eventually fall back to Voronezh, eventually fall back to the Don River. And historically, the Soviets basically retreated, got the hell out of there. Soviet Stavka was not expecting the main German assault to take place in the south. They were expecting an assault towards Moscow. So overall, very interesting. Battle of Sevastopol is underway, has yet to be completed. The whole Crimean Peninsula really has yet to be completed. So I don't know if the scenario is completely balanced. I mean, Sebastopol is really well fortified. Germans don't really have many strong units to take it, but historically, they only had these 4 units. They had the 3 corps of the German 17th Army, and then there's the 3rd Romanian Army here against Soviet naval forces and other units defending Sevastopol. And the Soviets recently launched a counteroffensive during the winter period across the Kerch Strait. And I believe it's at this stage that the German army counterattacks and effectively decimates the 51st Soviet army that you see there. So I really don't know how Army Group A is going to do it, but we can pull up the Google. And actually, I think just for the sake of education, I this is kind of spontaneous on my part. As you can tell, I didn't have my slides prepped before, but I figured I would do it now because I think it's just really interesting to see. But the first thing I want to show everybody is the front line. I think is really what I want to show you. I forgot what I actually meant to show you just there a second ago. Oh, now I remember. I was going to show you just the Crimean Campaign. It is not the Battle of Crimea. The Battle of Crimea, I believe, there's several in history, but the most famous one I think was against the Russian monarchy against the British and French. Or I think that was the Crimean War, actually. The Battle of Crimea, I think there is a moment that's known as the Battle of Crimea, but this is the Crimean Campaign because the conflict lasted for such a long time. It started in Barbarossa, So that's 1941, and wouldn't end until mid-1942. So almost a year. Well, I don't think a year, but around 8-9 months, if I'm not mistaken. Or actually, here it is. It starts in October and ends in July. So you can see that we're in June right now, and the Germans have a long ways to go before they actually take the city. So I just wanted to point that out, that this campaign is far from ending. Overall, I think that both sides are very well set up. I mean, the Soviet defenses on Moscow look superb. And you know what's the best thing about this is that I actually, this is based off of sources. This is not even my setup per se. I didn't really try to guess. I really tried to go off of actual data. And so I'm actually going to show you that data real quick, although I actually could just put a link below for those of you who are curious, but it is a Russian website. But before I do that, I do want to show, let me see, case blue map. I just kind of want to show people, the situation of the war at the start of 1942. I think actually the Battle of Moscow, I think actually might be a better tool to look at, because you really can see the Soviet counteroffensive operations, which is really what I want to show you. And so I saw a map there of the German operations, but here we go. Here's the Soviet operations that took place in December 1941 and would extend throughout the winter of 1942. I mean, there were several phases of these battles, but you can see that all the dark blue territory, all the shaded area, is the area that the Soviets took back, and you can even see the Soviet armies that are advancing. Here, for example, there's the 3rd and the 4th Shock armies, and they're right now here in this big bulge north of Moscow, right? Or here's Moscow. You barely can see it under the names of all the Russian generals, but you can see that it's north of Smolensk. And so that's essentially the bulge that we have here. And here is the 4th Shock Army. And I believe here is the 3rd Shock Army right there. Yeah. So although my setup isn't 100% accurate, I'm sure there's some flaws. You can get a sense of the accuracies I'm trying to go for. There's a 22nd Army over there. And it looks like I did not. Oh, I put the 22nd Army right over here. So it's nearby. So you can start seeing the similarities. And this actually might be a good source just to show you guys, how I went about setting up the Soviet units. So for example, here in the north, you can see there's Ryazhev right up there in Vyazma. So this is kind of the German bulge into the Soviet lines. And that's obviously what we're seeing over here. And you can see Soviets attacked with the 33rd Army, 50th, 10th Army, 29th. So let's see, those units are near. Yeah, there's the 33rd. 50th is right there. There's the 10th. So I think I've done a pretty good job, guys. I mean, check it out. 33rd, 10th, 50th are nearby. And there was another one too. Oh, the 29th, I think is a little bit more north. There may not even be a 29th in this game. I don't know. But it looks like there is no 29th Soviet Army here. Oh, well. But I just wanted to show that how interesting of a scenario we're in right now before the start of the next campaign. Clearly, the Germans, I think, have lost a lot of strategic momentum. I mean, this was really no local Soviet attack. This was no small-scale Soviet offensive to save Moscow. It was initially, and I say small scale, but it was critical, but it was localized in Moscow. But then what followed next was a massive series of Soviet breakthroughs. I mean, absolutely stunning Soviet gains, but very disorganized, and it would eventually be lost. A lot of the territories would be lost again to German counteroffensive operations of 1942. So a lot was happening in 1942 around Moscow. We kind of turn away from Moscow in 1942 and kind of shift our focus over to Stalingrad, obviously with Case Blue being the main show. And you can see that the Germans are now the ones gaining massive territory in the south. But there was a heavy fighting that went up in the north near Moscow, but the difference was that both sides were much more equally matched, and it was a bit more of a stalemate, not necessarily as intense of a stalemate as what we saw in let's say 1917, but it was at least at the operational level, or at the better yet strategic level, it was a stalemate. Tactically, operationally, there was probably changing hands back and forth. Some towns were taken here and there, but at the highest scale, the gains and losses were quite minimal compared to the gains and losses that we saw in the South with the German breakthroughs towards Stalingrad. And here's another picture. This is actually the Soviet counteroffensive. This is the Soviet counteroffensive post Stalingrad, and you can see there's a blue ring right there representing the encirclement of the Axis forces. Actually, blue and red ring there. So that's not what I want to show you, though. The last thing I want to show everybody is just my source. You know, you can go and pull up on YouTube. We can type in Eastfront animation. And here it is, Eastern Front of World War II animated. Amazing video. My intention here was not, oops, this view. Oh. This, by the way, this is not a sponsored video. So I'm gonna just mute the commercials and ignore them. So I was not intended to show any products here. I don't get paid or sponsored to show these commercials. I am waiting for the main video, which this is a very long commercial. Okay, here we are, people. And so we can go down here. Amazing YouTube channel. Check out Eastery. He did an incredible job of animating. These units here are actually cores. So this was actually my main source to get a sense of where the German units were positioned. And for example, here you can see, this is 1941. So I actually would want to show you a 1942 animation, so I can show you that. But he does an incredible analysis, strategic breakthrough. You learn so much about what's happening right now. But believe it or not, it says Soviet plans up here, but I think these are actually the German plans, if I'm not mistaken. But the Germans right now, they're trying to, with all these arrows, basically simplify the pockets. And you can see there's a push there in the south, in Crimea, dealing with attacks that were going on near Kharkov. So I'm not exactly sure where we are in the calendar. But anyways, he's showing you the big picture. And then he starts diving in and starts showing you some of the local German counterattacks. I'm actually going to lower the volume so I can talk over it. But you can see it's a really well done video, but this helped me pretty much figure out the German lines. German unit types are a lot more simple. You can see that the Soviets actually have all these divisions. I'm pretty sure these are divisions. A lot of Soviet divisions. But here on the German side, they're actually entire corps. That's the 47th Corps, the 53rd, the 35th, the 55th, the 13th, the 7th, and the 48th. And this is basically a bulge around Orel. Includes Bryansk, Orel, Kursk. So we can actually look at the map. And that's basically the central part here. And you can see there's the 53rd. I have the 48th, the 7th, the 13th, the 55th, I think I mentioned earlier. Yep. And even a 35th as well. So pretty reliable German source. And he actually attached his sources below. And I really want to show you guys that. It's a really cool website, Russian website. I believe it's this one. No, this is another Russian website. The one I want to show is Red. It's a Red Russian website. Here we go. It's all in Russian if you can't tell. So I recommend having some kind of translator app or, you know, Chrome extension or something like that. But the coolest thing about this is that if I put in the name of a Soviet army, let's say the Second Army, I'll put in 2. And it gives me the, oh, actually, I think I have to go to a different section. I think those are battles. I'm looking for armies. I think this might be units. I don't read Russian, so I can't tell you for certain which one it is. I hope to be able to read Russian one day, but today is not that day. But one of these websites will tell you the units, and if I only knew the word for units, I think it's this one here. Nothing here so far that suggests to me that it could be this one, but I think it is. And yeah, this is the one because I know the word army for the Soviets. But like, for example, the word tank in Russian would be TAHK, H being basically an N. So that's the second tankovi. So it's some kind of tank unit. But I'm looking for the second army. And I think this is the word right there. AP, P making R sounds, army. And so I'm just going to click on it. I don't know if this is the actual one or not. It may not be. But if it was the second shock army, it's really cool because you got all these dates. It must be some kind of guards unit. But this is probably not the best example. Maybe you should just do something a little easier, like the 50th army. See, so 50th motor or motos. I'm pretty sure that's motorized, some kind of motorized formation, tank, something. So if I click on this, it looks like it only lasted during Barbarossa, but basically you can see that it gives me a location and a date, and this is 1944, and then here it was in 1943. Not the most exciting example, but you can see that from 1943 to 1944, the Soviet unit advanced to the west, which makes sense because the Soviets were attacking during that time. Let me see if I actually try to type in the word army. That could actually army. Army has like two weird ends, which are actually eyes. I can actually freaking find it on my goddamn keyboard. Oh my god. Oh, there it is. Bingo. 50th army. And nothing showed up. That's unfortunate. I guess I do not know word army. Let's see, I clicked on another one. I just want to see. Well, at least I have the date ranges here. This one might be it. This is like some kind of 50th tank army. But you can see that the dates are basically showing from 1942 to 1943. And this unit, I guess, was in Siberia in 1942. Yep, it was in Manchuria. Oh no, it was actually, oh wow, that's actually pretty interesting. So it was located near Leningrad in 1944. And then it moved over to Manchuria in 1945 for the last major tank operation of World War II, I believe, which was the Soviet offensive to take Manchuria, basically from the Japanese. If I put in the first, some kind of unit's got to show up. 1943 to 1945. Let's see here. But you get a sense of all the units. Oh, looks like it has no data. But yeah, not really the greatest display of this website. But I gotta say, this website was what allowed me to create the setup for the Soviet side. And I was able to learn quite a bit about the placement of different units. Here's a pretty more interesting one. The Soviet unit was located near Kiev at the start of 1941. Then it looks like it fell back in 1943, which only makes sense. And then once we approach later dates of 1943, early 1944, we're seeing that the unit is actually starting to advance further west. And I guess it was in 2 locations, or maybe it was sent back. I'm not sure what's going on there. But anyways, you can get the feeling that Soviet units were pushed back in 1941, and then they came back later on in the war. And so there's some really interesting ones. I just have to kind of figure out which ones they are, but there's some that go all the way back to Moscow, and then they turn around and come back forward. And it's really cool. So that's that website. Again, if you want to see the source, you go on Eastery, pull up his videos, and he has the links down below. Some of these other links are not very reliable, but there are some interesting other Russian websites too. I think it pretty much sums up everything I wanted to talk about, at least in this video. You can get the sense that the Germans still have a number of small-scale operations they need to do. In mid-1942, before they can launch a full-scale summer operation to Stalingrad. I think the last thing I'd want to say is, before I even say it, the Soviet setups are very strong, especially in the center and the north. A lot of strong Soviet units up here, very impressive. The last thing I will say about the war right now is that the Germans completely underestimated the Soviets during the winter of 42. And what's worse is that Hitler never really seemed to learn his lesson. The German High Command didn't really seem to adapt very well for the remainder of the war, because a lot of their misassumptions that they had of the Soviet army in 1941 would be carried over into 1942. And one of the reasons why Stalingrad was such a failure was because the Germans left their flanks relatively undefended when they could have sent more units to defend them. Instead, they relied upon their minor Axis powers, like the Hungarians, Romanians, Italians. And it's not that these units were necessarily poor quality, but they were outmatched against the full juggernaut onslaught of Soviet assaults across the frozen rivers. They couldn't hold the line. And so operationally, the German army was just so heavily invested in Stalingrad, they forgot to reinforce the flanks, assuming that the Soviets were exhausted and they could only launch one winter offensive and not two. And so it was that miscalculation on the German side that eventually led to a big demise. Soviets' application of Maskarovka would pay off really well for the encirclement at Stalingrad only happened because Soviet High Command ensured that the Germans were never expecting the attack to take place. So very well done on the part of the Soviets, and not as well managed by the Germans. And there's the biggest problem I have with the entire conflict as a whole, with the German invasion of Operation Barbarossa, was their investment on Crimea. I can make a separate video for this, but I really want to say it now. The Crimean Peninsula, I think, was one of the biggest strategic blunders of the war. It's not to say that the Crimean Peninsula was, it's not to say that the German decision to take it was necessarily flawed. But ultimately, I think it was a big waste of resources. I think it's a reflection to the fact that the German army simply didn't really have a coherent plan to defeat the Soviet Union. There was a lot of infighting and indecisiveness by the German High Command, not just Hitler, but also his leadership, that eventually complicated Operation Barbarossa and would create complications for the rest of the war, one of them being the Crimean Campaign. An entire German army group, albeit a small one, but an entire army group was diverted to take Sevastopol. And although the Germans would come out on top and achieve a major victory, the victory in the strategic picture seems to lose its value a lot more. And this really does deserve a separate video. But the Germans don't gain all that much from Sevastopol. They get more support from their allies now that Sevastopol is secured. And basically, the chances of a Soviet naval operation against Romania is significantly reduced. And that's pretty much the strategic objective from the get-go was as one of inherent defense, strategic defense through operational offense. German nation, really Hitler, worried that the Soviets would be able to launch attacks against Ploiești, their oil. It's why the Germans would go for Sevastopol. It's also why the Germans would go for Crete in the south. These areas may not be seemed as strategically valuable, but as far as establishing a powerful defense around Ploiești, they certainly have their worth. And so it explains also in part why the German army wanted to take Greece, or wanted Greece neutralized and deny it any kind of support to given to the Allies. And it also explains why they took Sevastopol. The problem I have with these operations is that although they make sense in the long term, they ultimately take away from the prioritization of resources that are needed from some of the other major operations the German army was trying to do in order to win the war. I think these resources take away from the breakthroughs the German army needs further east. The mortar regiments that were sent to Sevastopol could have very well been sent to Leningrad. And the fact that Leningrad is another place that would be a very long siege of war created its own fair share of problems too, because now Army Group North, pretty much for the entirety of the Eastern Front campaign, once it cut off Leningrad, most of its efforts were used to siege the city. And the problem with that is that when you're sieging an entire city like Leningrad, Army Group North itself gets tied down. At a time when the German army needs another strategic win against the Soviets, now they have two army groups that are being tied down to these fortified regions. So I'd make the argument that the most successful Operation Barbarossa, or better yet, the most successful invasion of the Soviet Union, involves having as much offensive power as possible at any given time. And the fact that the Germans are diverting their assets to two areas that need to be dealt with, that still have very stubborn enemy resistance, I think is a weakness that eventually the Germans have to pay for dearly. And they pay for this in the form of not being able to use Army Group North offensively for the entirety of basically 1942 and 1943. It is simply Army Group North doesn't do anything for 2 years. I mean, a few localized operations here and there, but the bulk of the army is sitting and having itself defending positions. And Army Group A would eventually achieve its objective, but at a heavy cost. I mean, it took almost a whole year for the Germans, or let's say 8 months for the Germans to actually take Crimea. And all that fighting and all those resources would be strategically gained for what obviously allowed them to defend Romania, but this is at a time when the Soviets are under so much pressure, they don't even have the assets to really put any pressure on Romania. And what's more is that Case Blue, the attack on the Soviet oil fields, I guess you could argue there are some benefits of going around the flank there, but if their original objective was Batumi after all, or one of their objectives was Batumi, then there was really no need to take Sevastopol. One could argue they could have literally gone all the way around. And it goes to show that Case Blue was not in the operational plans at the start of Barbarossa. German army really expected to win at the end of 1941 and not in 1942. They were never expecting extended operations into 1942. So I think that's also a big problem. So anyways, I love this scenario and I love the setup, but the one strategic issue I have for the German side is their diverted resources in the wrong place. So if I had to set it up any differently, I would probably just leave one unit behind here, maybe two, and we'll transfer these 2 units to the north. Now the Germans are very much have the resources to assault Leningrad. And on top of that, we'll make Army Group North full strength, and Army Group A, I'm not sure what to do with it, but we basically have another Army Group that can support Army Group South and Army Group Center for any kind of local operations. And I think there definitely is some value in that for sure. So check it out. Now Army Group South can launch two, not one, but two major operations to possibly destroy the Soviets here. And this is serious. I mean, we could see all these Soviet forces destroyed right now. So that's the only thing I would change from this setup is that. Of course, if I were the Soviets, I would probably move this unit to the Ukraine and put some more pressure on the Germans, and maybe even launch operations on the flank. I don't really know what the Soviets can do if they decide to do a landing in Constanta. I mean they're going to have to have a successful landing, and even if they do, logistically it's going to be complicated for the Soviets, to say the least. They're going to need an HQ in Sevastopol if they want to do that. And they could, I guess in theory they could, but it's a tenuous situation, and right now there's so many vulnerabilities for the Soviets here in the Ukraine that I feel like any flanking attack over there is almost like a big waste of resources. But I just want to show what I would do to change the scenario a bit and focus on Leningrad. Take Leningrad as soon as possible so that Army Group North can do other things. Maybe put more pressure on the Soviet counterattacks, reinforce Army Group Center, and allow Army Group Center to be the main workhorse, and Army Group North can act as a support unit for Army Group Center. So I think I've made a long enough video. This video now is about, an hour long or so, but I really hope that whoever watched this video enjoys it, that I was able to enlighten you on some interesting subject material for the study of the Eastern Front, 1941, 1942, 1943 years in particular. This was insightful for the kind of first phase of the war, Axis initiative, yet still critical Soviet counterattacks like those at Moscow. And not really counterattacks, but counteroffensives, really, to emphasize the scale of those Soviet attacks. So without further ado, thanks for tuning in, and I will see you in the next video. Hope you learned something pretty sweet about World War II Eastern Front.